Welcome everyone to our third seminar. I'm glad that you can all be with us again. I know we've had a tumultuous few weeks here in our country, and I hope that you found some rest and peace nonetheless. Our speakers today will be Professor Cynthia Colburn from Pepperdine University and Professor Bryan Keene from Riverside City College to speak with us about the arts of death from the Middle Ages to the Renaissance in our first session. And then in our second session, I'll have the pleasure of hosting Professor Paul Contino, known to many of us at Pepperdine University, to tell us about and to speak with us about in a conversation about Dante on human limits. And you've all had in hand our readings from Bonaventure for the first session and from Dante, 3 cantos from each of the canticles for the second session. Our theme today, as you know, and as we have up here, is imagining the end, human limits. And we've had our first seminar where we thought about the human futures that our faith teaches in terms of the resurrection of the body, divinization or theosis, and possibly the universal return of all things that Father Luke spoke with us about in the Catholic imagination from Dana Gioia. In our second seminar, last time you'll remember, we thought about both utopia and dystopia as possibilities within the pre-Christian classical imagination, especially some philosophical movements that Stefano told us about, and then also about Christian monasticism and ideas about the ecclesia and the basileia, the church and the kingdom or the political community, the polis, the politeia, the republic, with Professor Robin Darling-Young. Today we're returning to our theme of human futures, but now meditating in our season of November after All Saints and All Souls, and with the gravity this season brings, to human limits and the death that we all face, whether we like to meditate upon that or not, and some of the arts that can help us with that imagination. I had reason to be reading the first chapter of the Gospel of John, and I was over the last week, and I was struck by the verse. This is from Gospel of John, chapter 1. He was in the world, and the world was made through him, yet the world knew him not. He came to his own home, his own people received him not. This is the, most supreme tragedy and dystopia of Jesus coming to the world, or the word coming to Jesus in the world, and the world not recognizing him, and the just profound disappointment, things gone wrong, tragic outcomes unforeseen, and the depth of the tragedy that, of course, is greatest at the cross. I was fond of, I forget where I read it, but when Nietzsche says, God is dead, that the Christian tradition should say, yes, we know, this is part of our understanding that God dies and Jesus is resurrected, but that, in other words, the Christian story contains greater depths and greater heights than the political situations we might find ourselves in, greater dystopias and greater utopias, sort of more valleys and more mountains on both sides. And I found that to be a fruitful meditation in these last few weeks. Our next seminar, just as a bit of news, as you know, will be on Saturday, January 23rd, our fourth seminar looking ahead, where we'll turn back to the question of the polis and imagining the polis and the ordered community when we get to read together from our book Utopia by St. Thomas More, where we get the idea that has inspired our seminar. So we'll be mailing you copies of all of those, and we'll send you probably some guidance about what to focus upon over the holiday break so that you can be reading that yourself. And we're very fortunate to have with us on Saturday, January 23rd for our fourth seminar, Professor Eric Nelson of Harvard University, who will be telling us about Thomas More in context, and we'll be able to ask some questions and some conversations with him. Without further ado, though, I think we should jump into our, I'm going to stop this frontispiece, jump into our first session, and I'll invite Professor Cindy Colburn and Professor Bryan Keene to take the floor and to present what you'd like to present.
Good morning, everybody. It's so nice to be here with you all today. And the sun has just come back out where I am. It was pouring this morning, so it's hopefully that's a good sign for our talks today. So as a child growing up, As a child growing up in the Catholic Church, I remember, and this is my Catholic Church from my childhood, I remember being struck by the macabre presence of the crucifix in the church. And yet, no matter how hard I tried to divert my attention from it and over to the peaceful image of Mary in the corner, I was always drawn back to the crucifix. I couldn't help but think, why, if God is love, would the church choose to place such a painful image in such a prominent spot in the church over the high altar? It took me many years to begin to understand why the Catholic Church often focuses on images of pain, suffering, and death. Through a very brief survey of the arts of death from the medieval period to the Renaissance, focusing on the Passion of Christ, I will share with you how, at least in my view, such painful works, which vary dramatically in terms of their levels of realism and idealism, can also serve as a source of hope and comfort when it is most needed. After my childhood exposure to such works of art through my faith, I came to study Catholic works of art as a student and later a professor of art history, and I continue to do so to this day. The primary tools of the art historian are formal and contextual analysis. So the formal analysis, and so we'll be using this today, the formal analysis focuses on the form of the work, in other words, everything that you can see, without looking up or studying anything about the work at all. And then the contextual analysis focuses on the context of the work, whether that's the historical context, political context, religious context. And so today I'll be privileging a little bit the formal context of the works, but the formal analysis, but I will also bring a little bit of the historical context in as well. I'd also like to add to these two methods a phenomenological approach to the works, just in a very basic way, which according to Gross, for example, sees the body as, quote, the instrument by which all information and knowledge is received and meaning is generated, end quote. So a work of art will speak to each of us differently, and even over the course of our own lives, it will change, it will speak to us in different ways as our embodied experiences change as well. So I just want you to keep that in mind as we start to look at some of these works. So we're going to start today in Florence. So we're jumping over to Italy and into Florence, and we'll be talking about two seemingly similar works, but on second look, very different works as well. And so on the left, you see Giotto's church crucifix in the Church of Santa Maria Novella, and on the right, you see Cimabue's crucifix in the Church of Santa Croce, both in Florence. Giorgio Vasari was a 16th century artist and biographer of artists, and he described Cimabue as the last great Byzantine artist, whereas he used the term Rinascita to describe the stylistic innovations of Giotto. According to Vasari, Giotto's genius as a painter marked the end of medieval painting and opened the way for the development of naturalism. Even Dante noticed this difference, saying, of painters, Cimabue deemed his name unrivaled once, now Giotto is in fashion and has eclipsed his predecessor's fame. Indeed, Giotto was a very successful artist. He had great fame early on, and he prospered financially as well. Michelangelo even later studied his works very closely. So the question is, when you look at these two works, and they do look so similar, what makes Giotto's work so different from Cimabue's work? Why was it so revolutionary? Why was he considered more of a proto-Renaissance artist rather than a late medieval or a Gothic artist? And so I think if we look at the works and examine them just formally, we can start to see some of the distinctions, although many of the formal qualities are similar in terms of the cross, the color schemes, the position of Christ. The way in which Giotto handles the body of Christ is very, very different from the way Cimabue handles it. And so you can see here when we look at Cimabue on the cross, how he seems to be, he's spread on the cross, but seems to be standing in some ways on the cross with a beautiful body, with these curves that are very elegant, almost looking somewhat, although he's shown in a slumber, kind of a sleeping death, he's almost shown triumphant at the same time with this elegant, very peaceful body at rest. In contrast, when we move over to Giotto's work, we see an image of Christ on the cross that is weighted down, right? Very heavy. You see you see a Christ who is asleep in a more tangible death, where we see the body through the modeling, right? The use of light and shadow seems to be more weight bearing and heavier on the cross. His head is down. We can't make out his face very well. The lower part of his face is almost completely in shadow. And so we start to see these really great distinctions in terms of how Christ is represented in death in this context in Florence at this time. And these images are very close together in time, right? We have Cimabue's from the 1280s and Giotto's from around 1295. So what we're starting to see here is a shift really from a medieval spirituality that focuses on otherworldliness in some ways to a Renaissance spirituality with its focus on humanism and the incarnation of Christ in a much more earthly kind of way that I think resonates with us very differently. So what's going on during this period, during the Duecento and the early Trecento? Well, we have warfare in Florence and the surrounding areas during much of the Duecento. This is between the Guelphs, who were favored the Pope. So these were the merchants, the artisans, and the city dwellers, and the Ghibellines, who favored the Holy Roman Emperor and was made up of primarily the nobility. In 1302, there was a revolt on the part of the nobles, an attempt to regain power that was put down in 1302. Hundreds of Ghibellines were exiled, including, for example, Dante, who we'll be hearing about later from Professor Contino, who wrote his greatest work while he was in exile, actually. So just a little bit of historical background there. Okay, we're going to move within Italy up to Padua. Here, not too far from Venice. And if you are heading to Venice, I would urge you to take a stop in Padua while you're on your way there, but do make a reservation if you would like to see the chapel that we're going to look at, because you do need a reservation to be able to get in. Usually it fills up pretty quickly. And so, and here we're going to look at the Scrovegni Chapel in Padua, which dates to about 1305. This was for many a turning point in Western art and patronage, or many would consider it this way. It was a private patron, Enrico Scrovegni, had this chapel built next to his palace. It's on the ruins of an ancient Roman arena, and it was one of the wealthiest, or he was one of the wealthiest, rather, private citizens in Padua. He was the son of a well-known money lender, and charging interest was considered a sin. Usury was considered a sin. He was in fact so well known that Dante actually placed him in the Inferno in his writings. The chapel is built, quote, in honor of the cult of the Virgin Mother of God and to honor and adorn the good city, state, and commune of Padua. And so probably in building this chapel, what he's seeking to do here is to perhaps expiate the sins maybe of his father. And so on one wall, we have a Last Judgment scene where Enrico Scrovegni is actually shown presenting a model of the church of this chapel to the Virgin Mary. So again, perhaps in return for a little bit of forgiveness this time. The church walls focus on the life of the Virgin and of Christ. And the dado below, which you see here, shows single figures of virtues and vices, representations or personifications of virtues and vices. The figures in the panels that are painted here are pretty austere and solid figures, yet they're very simple and expressive, really demonstrating their humanity. And this is something that Giotto is really known for kind of bringing into art during this period, and which is one of the reasons why he's seen as a kind of a transitional artist during this time between the medieval and the Renaissance period. And so if we look in more detail at one of the works, the Lamentation here, you can see that he removes all of the unnecessary elements. he focuses on, he certainly models his figures, and you can see that in the drapery, which is very much modeled. We don't see a lot of evidence of the body underneath the drapery, but certainly the drapery is modeled, making the figures look more, more grounded, for example, and more naturalistic. He also takes away the typical gold background that we often see in church paintings from the medieval period, and he gives us a blue landscape, and that landscape actually continues into the next panel beyond. So we get this sense of continuity and of nature. But what he's really most known for is the emotion, or at least what I consider him to be most known for, from me personally, is the emotion that he gives to the figures, right? That his figures are animated with this kind of level of emotion. So here we see the Lamentation of Christ. And if you look carefully at this work and start to pick apart just certain pieces of it, you can see Christ is shown in the arms of his mother, right? She's embracing him. It's as though she can't get close enough to him, right? To try to pull the life back out, and draw the life back into him, really. At his foot, you see a woman, perhaps Mary Magdalene, who's shown holding his feet here. Another woman holds his hands over here, this need to touch him. And then another figure whose backside we see here is shown just delicately embracing his head. And then if you look at the amount of emotion on the faces, again, this is something that is really very new, where you see people throwing their hands back in shock, the agony on the face of the Virgin, and then the angels, as you can see, and I'll show you some details in a second, kind of coming down from heaven and then seeing this horror and reeling back up in this very emotional way as well. And so this is something that Giotto is bringing to us now as we're entering into the Renaissance, leaving the medieval, this transition from leaving the medieval period into the Renaissance. And so here again, you can see more of the emotion with the small eyes of the Virgin, the open mouth, as she supports Christ here, and then of course the angels as well, and the emotion on their faces as they show as they react in very human ways to the death of Christ. Okay, we're going to move now a little bit beyond Italy and go up to the north, to Belgium, and specifically to Louvain, where we'll look at one work of art, an altarpiece. And so this depicts the deposition of Christ from the cross. And so we can see the cross in the background in this kind of stage-like setting. The deposition was a very popular theme in the 15th century because of its really dramatic, personally engaging nature. It really brings you in, and you can engage with each one of the individual figures, as we will do a bit of here. The scene, as I said, appears to be set in a shallow stage with a gilded background, so this golden background. And the figures are almost life-size. So when you see this work, it's really quite powerful because you're seeing it in this form where you're connecting with it on a lifelike type of stage. And really, it's kind of the theatrically unfolding for you as you're looking at it. The figures, because they're pushed to the foreground and they're almost life-size, they kind of force the viewer to identify with the grief of the people who are present in this depiction. You have very, also typical of the North, very portrait-like faces, which add to the realism of the piece and the emotion that it evokes. There are some elements also of contemporary dress within this that also make it more present for the viewer who's looking at it at this time. There's a very sculptural quality to the painted figures. They are modeled in a way where they look very, very lifelike and sculptural and three-dimensional. As one art historian puts it, Harbison, he says, we see living, breathing, dying, and crying flesh in this context. And so a real emphasis on humanity, which would be appropriate during the Renaissance with its emphasis on humanism. And so I'll take you into the painting in a second with some details, but you have the Virgin's fainting body here, which mirrors in form the body of Christ as well. their arms and hands shown very close to one another, showing their ashen skin, right? Where life has really left both of them in this moment in some ways. John the Evangelist is shown supporting the Virgin, as he is typically, at least known to do in these kinds of paintings. And over to the side, you have Mary Magdalene, who's shown kind of almost wringing her arms in this kind of intense anguish, where her body takes the form of her anguish, of her just incredible dismay at what's happening in this scene. And so in this contorted pose of hers. We also have Joseph of Arimathea, who is shown holding the body of Christ, bearded over here up in the, closer to the cross. And then Nicodemus, the Pharisee, over here holding the feet of Christ as well. Each of the mourning figures, if you look at them closely, you can see that they each act in individual and very personal ways, again, alluding to the humanism of the Renaissance. But also to an understanding, the artist has a very clear understanding of the notion that, we each respond to loss like this, we grieve in different ways. And you can see that coming across. It's a very personal response to this loss. Also, before we go to some details, the color is used incredibly effectively. If you notice which colors are most prominent, you'll see, right, the white that is the white for starters of Christ's body and the Virgin, but also then the white garments that encircle him. And this is carried through so that the white forces your eye, the colors bring your eye from one. It's almost like you flitter next to another figure over here, and you can't stop there. You're brought up to the angel again, this white, bright white fabric, and then the white over here and down. So in doing this, what the artist is doing is causing us to move our eye around the entire painting, not to miss out on any one person. And the same is done with red, which likely symbolizes the passion of Christ. And so again, with the Mary Magdalene, the red of her arms, and as we move up, we're brought to travel throughout the painting, making sure that our eye falls on each individual so we can understand each person's individual response to this theme. So I just want to show you the level of detail. One of the things that the Northern artists are known for is this amazing detail, and that's possible because they're using oil paint. And so oil takes a very long time to dry, so you can add an enormous amount of, you can spend time on specifics. And so this realism was something that was really a profound part of Northern Renaissance art, whereas in the South, in Italy, and I know I'm generalizing, but in the South in Italy, you had more idealized images of naturalism. And so this is why I bring you some of these details to show you the incredible detail of how these tears were painted on. You can imagine even the painting itself being almost in the emotional response the painter must have been having as he worked through this. Here you see the tears of the Virgin again coming out of her eyes, and her ashen skin, her parted lips, and even the blueness of her lips, showing that the life has left her in some ways as well as she faints. Christ, where we see his parted lips and teeth, and then the Joseph of Arimathea trying to support his body, and then the face of Nicodemus gazing down in this way. And also notice, by the way, the textures that are possible in this medium as well. That wouldn't be possible in tempera if you were using tempera in Italy, for example. In the face of Mary Magdalene, and her body all tensed up. And so again, the notion is that each of these individual figures is responding individually to the grief of Christ. And so what the artist is doing for us who are maybe seeing this work in the context of a church, we're being brought into this and we're able to meditate on the emotion and the grief of each of these individuals. And perhaps it resonates with us as well in terms of something we may have gone through in our own lives. The next work I'm going to show you briefly is from Eisenheim, Germany. So we'll move down here. So we're still in this Northern Renaissance style and this realistic style. And so here's an image. This shows you the work as it's displayed today. This is a work by Matthias Grunwald. This is the Eisenheim Altarpiece. And we're going to start with the formal analysis of this. We can read the iconography of the work, of course. This is a crucifixion. It looks very different than the other images of the Passion of Christ that we've seen. This is not an image of a radiant Christ on a cross, as in Chimabue's work. It also goes well beyond Giotto's weighty Christ, image of Christ, who looks to be almost sleeping on the cross. Instead, what we have is really a shockingly realistic image of a dead Christ on the cross, and one who suffered terribly. His lips are open and blue. His body hangs heavily on the cross. Rigor mortis appears to have set in his hands, but most telling are the skin lacerations and congealed blood that we can see that spread across his body in this scene. This was actually created, and this is an important part of this work, it was created for a monastic hospital, the Monastery of St. Anthony in Eisenheim, Germany. And this hospital treated a horrific skin disease called colloquially St. Anthony's fire. When the altarpiece was opened, Christ's arm here would separate from his body, perhaps alluding to the amputations that may have taken place in this hospital, actually. So what you have here is a work that shows that really the incarnation of Christ is truly felt here. Just like us, Christ is a human being. Christ feels pain. Christ suffers, and Christ died. But it's through this suffering that the love and devotion of Christ and of God is also shown to those who suffer, and specifically those who were suffering in this hospital. So this altarpiece was located in the choir of a church adjacent to the monastery hospital. So the work spoke directly to the patients themselves, who were suffering in this hospital, as well as to those who were caring for them, who perhaps saw themselves treating Christ himself. And this recalls for me Matthew 25:40, whatsoever you do for the least of my people, you do for me. In this case, Christ is the person who is suffering and the patients are suffering. And so these individuals caring for them are caring for Christ as well. So one could not really look at this work without seeing that Christ understands the suffering that occurred in this space and was with the sick and the caretakers. While we all wish for a miracle in life when terrible things happen, the Catholic faith makes clear that the cross is a part of life. But Christ's presence in that suffering, and specifically because he suffered and therefore understands, perhaps this is what makes that pain more bearable, as does faith in life after death. So just to elaborate on some of the other figures, on the left is Mary, John the Apostle, and Mary Magdalene down here. And then John the Baptist over here. And then we have a lamb with a cross and the chalice, so representing and alluding to the sacrifice of Christ. But then over here, these figures are shown really in complete agony, which suggests that they're not really aware or perhaps that Christ will be resurrected in this context, whereas John seems a lot calmer, right, in this context, knowing what will happen. In the left panel is Saint Sebastian. He lived at a time of great persecution of Christians under the Roman Emperor Diocletian, and he was said to have encouraged a Roman soldier to convert to Christianity, and upon that conversion, the soldier was cured of a plague. And so perhaps this is why he's present. So he is often prayed to by people who are ill. And then on the right, actually, you have St. Anthony, again, the namesake of the hospital. He was known for enduring torment, among other things. And so in fact, I'm not sure if you can make it out, so I have to move you guys around, but in terms of, the presence of a demon overhead, but St. Anthony was was known for enduring these torments of demons, etc. And I think this calls to mind in some ways the emotional and mental toll that sickness takes on both the sick and those caring for them, which can be very painful. And so the demons that torment Anthony may be alluding to this as well. And then finally below, we see the lamentation of Christ in all its realism as well, with the body cleaned and prepared for burial. And perhaps we can connect those who care for the body of Christ to those who are working in the hospital as well. But that's not the entire, all of what we see in the altarpiece. There is more. And so when we open this, we see that we have actually from left to right, and an Annunciation scene, a very positive, powerful Annunciation scene. We have an image of the Virgin and Child with an angelic orchestra over here. And then we have, of course, the resurrection of Christ here with a radiant image of Christ and his body, shown with no wounds except for the simple red marks of the in his hands and his feet, and his skin now completely cleared, and his head and face almost completely disappearing into the light in this way. And so focusing on the positive as well in this context. And so in some ways, what we have is a reminder of the presence of Christ and his understanding of the suffering, but also a reminder of life, a eternal life to come in terms of the resurrection. The suffering is not for nothing. Just to provide a little bit of historical context, the 16th century, when this was created, was a time of political and military turmoil as the Holy Roman Empire is expanding. And it was also a time of fundamental religious change as well, as the Catholic Church and the position of the Catholic Church was being challenged during the Protestant Reformation. Here's just a detail of the resurrection. And I wanted to also show another part of this altarpiece just here, where you have Anthony being tormented again by demons. So a notion of this kind of constant torment of those who are ill, and especially those who are dying. Here's a detail of that. Okay, so we'll go back to Italy shortly, just for a brief period. And here we'll be going to back to Florence, in fact, here. And so the historical setting that I just mentioned is also relevant to the next work that we'll look at from Italy. In 1517, the Augustinian monk Martin Luther challenged the corruption of the Catholic Church. And then after Rome was sacked, Rome was also sacked in 1527 as these kinds of wars were raging over Italy at the time. And so there was great unrest in Italy. And so the Renaissance ideals, focusing on the primacy of man, and in fact the High Renaissance, which really focuses on these heroic images of humanity and beauty, were perhaps considered not to be quite cutting it for artists during this period. And so we see a shift at this time. So after the death of the High Renaissance artist Raphael in 1520, we start to see new artistic trends emerging in Italy. And the most significant was called Mannerism. And this coexisted with the later styles of Michelangelo and Titian as well. And it remained influential until the end of the 16th century. The Renaissance artists were interested in studying, imitating, and idealizing nature, in contrast to the Northern realism that we talked about. So it was an idealized form of nature. The Mannerists, then this is a Mannerist work, the Mannerist artists instead used other works of art as their models, sometimes literature. And so you see in Mannerist works, the figures are often elongated, exaggerated, sometimes in a very elegant way, sometimes distorted though, and they're arranged in often complex twisting poses, and the composition also loses its balance, that kind of harmonious High Renaissance balance. So in other words, classical Renaissance symmetry doesn't really apply anymore. So the Mannerist works instead create a real sense of instability in figures and objects. The spaces are also often compressed and crowded, and the figures, as you can see here, they push to the end of the picture plane as well. And so we'll just look for a minute here at some of these features. You can see here, we're not quite sure, the subject matter in Mannerism is also sometimes unclear. We're not quite sure what's going on here, right? We believe this, you would think, okay, and in fact, this is Mary, Christ. So is this a deposition from the cross? Or is it a lamentation? There's no cross present, so we don't have very clear subject matter, which is typical of the Mannerist period. So our mind has to think about this a little bit. If this were a Renaissance work, we'd have something right in the center, right? A real clear symmetry in the composition. Instead, we kind of have a gaping hole in the center with no figures really that present right in the middle of the composition. So things are, our eyes are pulled in different directions in kind of an edgy, kind of way. So the space is a little bit more ambiguous. Christ is supported by two individuals. You can see the discomfort here in terms of the back, underneath the weight of the body of Christ. And then the colors also are somewhat different in the Mannerist period with these pastels, although we're starting to see some of that as more works are cleaned in Italy. We're starting to see the presence of this color palette in other areas as well. And so you have these then anxious glances looking around, which are perhaps a more accurate reflection of the anxiety of the time as Italy is suffering at the hands of great powers who are fighting over Italy at this time. And so, so again, another view of what this kind of composition can look like as well. A similar subject matter, but looking very different in a different time and responding to different views. Okay, and finally, I would just like to end with Simon Taparovsky's Crucifix in the Our Lady of the Angels Cathedral, so to bring things back home. Simon Taparovsky created this work, where he was commissioned to create this work in 2000 for the new Our Lady of the Angels Cathedral. And I find this cross really interesting, this crucifix and the story behind it very interesting, again, because it shows how sometimes these works need to respond to a given time and a given community, for example, that's who are worshiping in these spaces. In this case, the artist wanted to have a glass cross, and he proposed a glass cross that would hang high above the altar. And so with an image of Christ hanging on the cross, so that you would see the cross, but then not see it. So you would have an image of Christ that was both, it would represent in some ways crucifixion and resurrection, right? And kind of this transcendent image of Christ. But in the end, he was told he won the competition for the commission, but he was told that the cross couldn't be high off the ground, right? And so it ended up on a wooden cross and close to the ground, because it would be incredibly important for the faithful to be able to interact with the work of art, right? To touch it. And so that's what we see happening here. And so this ended up having a really large impact on what the final work looks like. And so how it actually would be used in worship in this space, and what the artist, for example, originally saw is different than what the final product was, the final work of art looks like. Okay, thank you very much. That's what I have for you today. I'm happy to take questions for a little bit before Bryan begins.
Thank you, Cindy. We have about 45 or 50 minutes until we take our break. So the plan is for for students, for everyone else, to have a chance to interact with what Cindy's shown us, these amazing moving images. And we'll have some discussion now, and then we'll hear from Bryan next, and then some more discussion. So I see Ben has a hand up.
Yes, in the image of the entombment before this one from that from the Renaissance period, the characters holding Christ's body are looking at the viewer, and I wonder if you have any thoughts on what that does in terms of the scene, because you mentioned that we don't really know what the scene is.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so it wasn't uncommon to have figures looking out at the viewer to bring them in. In fact, Alberti, who's an artist and who also wrote treatises on art at this during the Renaissance, actually suggested that a figure kind of be bringing the audience in. And so this would be a way to connect and to engage with the viewer directly and bring them into the work. And we do believe this could represent either a deposition from the cross or perhaps an entombment. But most people do believe it does represent a deposition from the cross. And I'll ask Bryan to actually jump in anytime he'd like to too, because he's a specialist in this area. So.
And would we pulling them in be like in an accusatory manner or in a guilting manner, or would it be just another one of Christ's followers?
Well, that's really interesting that you say that, because I would have thought it was, drawing you in to be able to meditate on what was happening. But in terms of, there are many ways in which you could read it, like look at this. How could this happen? How could we have done this? How could this be possible? And so I think that you would, the expectation would be that you would read it as it would speak to you in this context. And that's the case with all of these different works. And the viewpoint will change over time and depending upon who's looking at them. So it's a great way of looking at it. Great question.
Anne-Marie.
Yeah, thank you for your talk. I really, really enjoyed that. I don't spend enough time looking at these kinds of things. My question is kind of specific. So you mentioned that the Scrovani Chapel in Padua was built on a former Roman arena. Mm-hmm. And that kind of got me thinking about the athletic competitions, exhibition battles, what a Roman arena was like. It was a really emotionally charged space with a specific emphasis on the body. Is the chapel and the art in the chapel supposed to be a reinterpretation of that space, or is this just coincidence?
That's really, again, a really, really interesting question and a really interesting observation. I think you see a lot of reuse of space and sometimes trying to take over a space to reclaim it for a new way of seeing, a new way of looking. It's not uncommon anywhere in the world. This happens frequently, especially when it comes to religious spaces, but also some secular spaces too. So it's very possible that there was some intentionality here. I don't know in terms of the focus on the body and some of the imagery as well. I don't know if it was intentional or it just seems to be, or if it was just happenstance that this happened. But it's a really interesting way to look at the space. Certainly, I would say frequently you see Christian structures being built intentionally over spaces, maybe where things that in order to override perhaps some of the activities that went on in those spaces beforehand. So that wouldn't be surprising in terms of the specific program, the specific painting program, I'm not sure, but really, really good, interesting way to look at it. Thank you.
Thank you.
Audrey, go right ahead.
Oh, I liked when you were talking about your experience growing up looking at a crucifix in the church, because that's not something that most Protestant churches will feature as like a necessity to have. Mm-hmm. What is the purpose of the crucifix and the suffering and kind of the uncomfortableness being center in a place of worship?
Mm-hmm. Well, it's interesting you say that, because there was another part I thought about including in this talk, but I figured I would be running short on time as well. And also wasn't sure in terms of the audience, but when I really started to understand, so I studied, what the meaning could be, how people could relate to these images, right? And but really, when I really recognized the importance and how a work like this could resonate and could be a part of healing in a way, was when people are suffering, is when my husband was diagnosed with cancer and ultimately died. And so I found myself, instead of kind of being, oh, I don't really want to look at the crucifix, meditating on the crucifix, actually, because, in my church here in Malibu, oftentimes it's a very emaciated image of Christ. And so to see that suffering, I really did get a sense like, you get this, and I could really, I responded to it in a completely different way during that stage in my life. And I would imagine someone who was sick also would respond, and maybe it would be hard, maybe it might not be comforting for all, but I found it to be a source of comfort. to understand first that that Christ was human, felt this, and understands what I'm going through right now and is with me, but also this reminder of what's to come, that this has to happen for something else, and that there is something better afterwards. So that was when it really came to me. I don't know that I have it right, but that is that it really did speak to me in that way, and I think that could perhaps be the intention behind it. Thank you for that question.
Thank you. I see hands from Jason and Father Luke. Maybe we'll have Jason and then Father Luke, if you don't mind. Maybe we can hear from Bryan, because I want to make sure we reserve enough time for what he's prepared. And then we'll have more time for conversation as a group. Jason.
Thanks, Cindy. That was fantastic. I guess the question I have is, there's this whole problem of the work of art in the museum, which is how we tend to confront the work of art. And it's related to Audrey's question, which is the doing of art, like what's art doing? And it's not ever doing just one thing, but the way that modern people tend to confront art, high art, is they go to a decontextualized space and sort of like view things in a white, I like museums, don't get me wrong, but it's a problem, right? If you think of people like Martin Heidegger or Walter Benjamin. And so my question is, was there something in the doing of art in humanism or in the Gothic period that is either in rupture with one another, or that is a source for a different kind of art? I even heard in sort of what you were saying right now, which was very beautiful, about the devotional, almost therapeutic aspects of art within a church, say, instead of, say, within a museum space. Not that you can't be healed by art within a museum space per se, but is there something, I guess my question is historical. Do you see something in humanism? Clearly you admire it, you focused on it a lot. Do you see something in the doing of humanistic art that is something we can learn, or is a contrast point to museum art?
Well, it's interesting because, all these works were originally in religious spaces, and so they're meant to be seen in that way. And there's a lot more talk now about trying to get some of these works back into their religious spaces so that we can see them in the way they were meant to be seen. And the other problem with museums, and again, I love museums too, is that you usually are confronted by a label with a little bit material. I have some of my survey students, they write a label. So, and it's an object that's already in a museum, and I tell them to think of an alternative narrative, but I have them hand in a ton of information and research on this so that they realize in the end, now you have to distill that down to a 500-word label, or worse yet, a 250 or 150-word label, because there have been studies done on how long people will sit in front of a work of art, and it's shockingly, shockingly short amount of time. And so when you think about so much, when you talk about the different meanings, there are all these different interpretations that are out there, the ways we can look at a work of art, but then, and that exist, right? That have been discussed, researched, written about. Then there's also your own personal response, right? Should you be limited by a label, or will the label take you in another direction? And your question is making me think about the Getty as well. Several years ago, they did an exhibition on the icons from St. Catherine's, from Mount Sinai and St. Catherine's. And this was incredible. These had never traveled, they had never left the Sinai Peninsula in Egypt. And so they really were very thoughtful, as I understood it from friends, working with the Getty and talking to people about how to install this exhibition, because they recognized that so many people who had never seen these works would be coming into the space to see them as religious icons, right? As images that were incredibly important to them for worship. And so they did do things like they, brought the lights down. They had, if I remember correctly, some music being pumped in. They weren't going to allow any tours that were spoken so that people could respect the works. And I think that, trying to recreate that kind of context in a museum is really impossible. But there was an attempt made there. But it speaks to how we divorce these works from their original intentions. If I were to be, I don't keep a crucifix in my home. I've been gifted many. I'm a Catholic. You get crucifixes as gifts. That's common. If someone dies in your life, you get even more. I don't keep them in my home because that's not the space where I'm in that meditative space to take that on, right? I can have a cross in my home, but I don't keep a crucifix. When I'm in church, I'm in a space where I'm prepared for that. I'm folded in prayer. It is a different space for me personally. That doesn't mean that others don't keep crucifixes in their home, but I think that there is this problem in terms of whether or not, what seeing a work in a certain context versus another context. And I think maybe you can go to a museum, and if you're looking for that to be moved by that work in this way, but that's not how we're wired, especially and that's not, even though we're often walking into temple facades to get into these museums, we're still not wired to see them in this religious kind of way. So I don't know if I fully answered your question, Jason, but I'm happy to talk to you more about it later too, in the interest of time.
Thank you. Yes, and these are always, unsatisfyingly brief conversations, but we hope we can continue them in other spaces. I'm going to invite Father Luke and Jack and Jack Bekos, if you could put your questions in the comments for now, so we can move to Bryan, so Bryan can present what he prepared, and then, or if you wish, you can wait, and we'll come back to you first when our conversation continues after Bryan.
Thank you. It is an immense pleasure to be here. I hope everyone can hear me all right. Cindy, thank you for inviting me to speak with you. It's an honor to finally be able to share the virtual stage with you after all these years of friendship. And Cindy is really the reason I study art history and devoted my life to this pathway. Unlike Cindy, I was raised in the Protestant tradition, and following my time at Pepperdine, where I did my undergraduate work, I entered into seminary thinking that I wanted to study ancient biblical languages, and was studying Greek and was set to study Ugaritic and Hebrew, but then was hired by the Getty Museum, incidentally, right at the start of the Sinai exhibition. And I do remember the real power of those images. In the first weeks of the show, visitors would take their shoes off at the entrance of the exhibition. The amount of cleaning that had to take place on the vitrines every day because people were kissing and touching and prostrating in front of the images. The people that brought bodily relics, locks of hair that would be sent back with the crates to Sinai for those visitors who couldn't visit the museum directly. And then in the final weeks of the show, seeing people show up in wheelchairs and on hospital gurneys in order to be in the healing presence of the icons. I mean, it was a really incredible experience. Because of that question that Jason asked, I think I'll modify slightly some of my remarks to think about the museum context a little bit as it relates to the objects. I also wanted to start thinking about where we are in our moment. If you can all just look out your window for a moment. I like that Cindy began with the sunshine coming in from her window. It's still sprinkling out where I am here in Valencia. And I'm reminded of the writings of St. Francis, who reminds us to think about the world around us as a way to connect with the divine. So in the Canticle of the Sun, there's this wonderful phrase that I think reads nicely in Italian. It was written in Latin, but I have it here for you in both. Lodato sii, mio Signore, per fratello vento, e per l'aria, e per il cielo, per quello nuvoloso, e per quello sereno, e per ogni stagione tramite la quale alle creature dai vita. Lodato sì, mio Signore, per sorella acqua, la quale è molto utile e umile, preziosa e pura. Part of the discussion that I'm interested in having today is the way in which texts from the 12 and early 1300s encouraged viewers and the faithful alike to commune with God through their senses, which Dr. Colburn has already introduced us to, this idea of an embodied experience, a phenomenological encounter with works of art. And in my home at this moment, I have myrrh being diffused, because throughout Bonaventure's text, he talks about the metaphor of myrrh, smelling myrrh, and gathering bundles of myrrh as he gathered text and wisdom from the Gospels and the patristic writings. So in the works of art that I will be discussing, part of my experience has been communing with friars and with nuns, with monks and other religious figures, to talk about how these works are viewed today, as well as how they were viewed in the past, because a number of the communities still active in Florence, where I do most of my work, continue to use the images as portals for devotion. But the discussion in our last session of the Nova Forum really inspired me to zoom out. There were questions about Buddhism and about other global traditions, and I wanted to just share a few reflections about sacred groves and trees in global manuscript cultures of the medieval and Renaissance world, because I think having this sort of broader mindset helps us to see the ways in which the natural world has informed a number of religious encounters in our world historically and today. One of the objects that I really loved getting to learn more about and working closely with our Jewish neighbors here in Los Angeles is this manuscript from the 16th century, written by a Jewish scholar whose family and entire community were expelled from Spain in 1492. He journeyed across North Africa to the Holy Land and eventually to Poland, where this work was printed. And it's called the Sephardic Tree. And it uses this long-standing medieval idea in Judaism, Christianity, and Islam to structure knowledge and to structure theology and experiences through the metaphor of a tree, that the branches, the trunk, the fruits or the leaves and the roots themselves can be a guide for spiritual enlightenment. Sephirot means emanation, and you'll see 10 emanations here that represent qualities through which the divine, or God, makes themselves known to humanity. The top is the crown of knowledge or wisdom, and then we pass through these emanations of understanding, wisdom, kindness, judgment, splendor, eternity, foundation, and then the kingdom, which is the earth itself. And then there are 22 branches that connect these, which are each given to a letter of the Hebrew alphabet. And that's a similar way of structuring knowledge that we'll see in Bonaventure, using alphabetic knowledge, letters, to help us move throughout our devotional practices. In Christianity, of course, the theme of the Garden of Eden as a typological event from the Hebrew Bible, the Old Testament, and Christ's suffering on the cross in the crucifixion is beautifully visualized in this prayer book, which an owner would have read from every 3 hours. For 8 times during the day, you would open the Book of Hours and say the prayers. My colleagues and I at the Getty attempted this at one point. I would arrive first hour of sunlight in the morning around 5 or 6 a.m. and would begin to say some of the prayers. And then 3 hours later, several of my colleagues would continue. And it really got us into the spirit of what was medieval monastic and then personal devotion like. You can see in the tree there is Christ crucified. His blood flows down the trunk of the cross, which is wrapped with the serpent, in this case visualized as a sort of female figure, because serpiente is feminine in many of the Romance languages, and there's that underlying misogyny there if you'd like. And then Adam and Eve sort of picking from the fruit. And this image introduces a prayer to those 5 wounds of Christ. If you remember the image that Dr. Colburn showed in the Scrovegni Chapel by Giotto, each of the figures were focusing on or holding one of the wounds of Christ, holding on to those the hands, the feet, and looking at the side as a way to guide devotion. And then in the Islamic world, I think often about trees and plants and garden imagery. This was a manuscript at Wright showing Yusuf, or the Hebrew prophet Joseph, in the garden in Africa, the Princess Zulukaya. The water that flows throughout is described as purifying, cleansing. The scent of the trees is described throughout this text. And when you visit gardens in former Islamic palaces or mosques, you hear the sound of trickling water and can smell the fragrant citrus blossoms and so forth. I think that analogy of the experiences that we have in nature and then the text that we take with us, either from the Quran in the case of Islam, from the Bible, or from the Torah, as guides for spiritual practices, is something to keep in mind today. And then just quickly, I hate to sort of short shrift Eastern traditions, but in working at the Getty, I brought together several manuscripts from Hinduism, Jainism, and Buddhism. And before I was able to borrow them from the LA County Museum of Art, the curator encouraged me to meet with local members of these communities to understand how they would be viewing the objects in the museum today. Not unlike the icons that I discussed a moment ago and that Cindy introduced us to, many of the visitors spent time in the gallery reading from the texts, bowing before them or prostrating themselves before them. Some even brought food or monetary offerings, which we had to think about having a space in the museum for those devotional objects. So at left, we have Krishna, an avatar of Vishnu, and his consort bringing the coral tree from heaven as seen as paradise, down to earth. And then at right, you have this image where a serpent tempts one of the religious figures in Jainism that would go on to be a spiritual guide. His name is Mahavira. And because he resists the temptation of the serpent, he then is able to reach this enlightened state. And then for the life of the Buddha, manuscript cultures throughout the medieval period tell of the number of encounters that he himself had in groves, reaching enlightenment under the sacred Bodhi tree. And then one of the bodhisattvas or guides to spiritual enlightenment is the Chintamani Buddha that gives wish-bearing gems from the sacred tree to those who are faithful. And then to bring it really home, I'm currently speaking to you from Tataviam land in Valencia. Cindy is in Malibu on Chumash ancestral land. And this is one of these incredible, over 1,000-year-old arbor glyphs or carvings into the trunk of a tree relating to the equinox throughout the year and a number of constellations mapped onto this tree trunk. So a number of cultures around the world throughout time have used trees as metaphors for spiritual enlightenment and for connecting with the divine. And that brings us to St. Bonaventure's Lignam Vitae. I chose a text by St. Bonaventure primarily because he is canonized on a day that I share close importance with Cindy Colburn. It's April 14th. That's our shared birthday. He's canonized 200 years after his lifetime. And so it was a text and a figure that has resonated with me. This is probably one of the most famous altarpieces that is made to visualize the text that's written in the 1260s or so. But then throughout the 1300s, we see a number of visualizations of this altarpiece, which is nearly 9 feet tall. I have a reduced 18-inch version in my office. So similar to Cindy, I don't keep these devotional objects in my home, but I keep this in my office as a sort of guide to constantly meditate, to take a walk outside, to be among nature. And it helps as a spiritual guide when I'm talking to students to better understand this image. It was made for a group of Franciscan nuns or Clarissan nuns who follow the writings and the teachings of Saint Clare, one of Francis's followers. And it's in a church in Florence, but you have to walk southwest along the Arno River. You're sort of going further outside of the city. So it was a quiet spot in the medieval and Renaissance period, beyond the walls, beyond the hustle and bustle of the community. And the nuns are really within this space, praying and thinking about the image. This is what the church looks like today. It was heavily remodeled in the 16th century, but there is still in the church preserved a crucifix that was made right around the time that the altarpiece I just showed was made. So that's right around the early 1300s, when there was great artistic output in the city of Florence. The newly created mendicant groups of the Dominicans and Franciscans, which formed around the teachings of Francis and Dominic in the 1200s, began to commission works of art with great frequency, which then inspired their local monastic brothers and sisters, the Augustinians, the Carmelites, and others, to also create works of art. And so for the Clarissan nuns at the time, they had the crucifix, which would have stood either above the altar or over a screen that separated the religious community from the laity, from those members of the community that had not taken vows for the church. So they have this image of the crucifix with the blood of Christ flowing down into the altar space. So symbolically, the blood flowing from Christ's wound down his side into the chalice above the altar. And then here's the altarpiece itself, which was either in a private space for the nuns or in the church itself. We're not entirely sure. It was found in a storeroom about to be thrown out in the 19th century, in fact. One of the points I like to mention at this stage is that the background, which looks incredibly dark, it appears almost black, was in the 1300s bright blue. A combination of lapis, which is a blue from Afghanistan, a very vibrant blue. It's the blue of this ring that I'm wearing, in fact, and azurite, another blue itself. But it's darkened over time from soot and ash. So imagine, if you will, a brilliant blue, the color of my scarf, if you will, that really caused the figures in gold and the branches to jump out at us. And what we see and what we read in the text by Bonaventure are these 12 branches on which grow 4 fruits, each of them. What the artist in this case has done is the final 48th fruit is the entire sphere of heaven above. So that triangular pediment at the top there is heaven, where all saints, in fact, look out at the viewers, and not directly out, but they look down at the viewers, because this 9-foot-tall altarpiece is one that you would have looked at looking up. And so imagine all of the heavenly hosts and the saints looking down at you. So to the question that was asked earlier, they then become your conduit to connect with paradise above. And then at the very bottom of the cross, Mount Golgotha there is present, but Bonaventure himself is there looking out at all of us. So he's the one that you would have looked directly at when you're staring at the altarpiece in the church. And in the museum where this hangs today, it's the same museum where Michelangelo's David is. It's actually right on the way as you exit the Accademia. So I think many people are, they saw the David, they're ready to leave through the bookshop, and there's this 9-foot tall altarpiece that people, rush past. But looking at some of those formal qualities that Cindy called our attention to earlier, you see that the tree is growing out of the Garden of Eden, that paradise space from the book of Genesis. And in fact, when you read other writings of Bonaventure, he's constantly drawing our attention to this tree of life on which hangs the crucified body of Christ. And if you want to regain paradise, you have to go through Christ. That tree of knowledge of good and evil from Eden is now the cross on which Christ is crucified. And so you see that scene of the creation of Eve from the side of Adam in the lowermost left, the eating from the fruit of the tree of knowledge of good and evil, the expulsion. And from that expulsion flow the 4 rivers of the Garden of Paradise. And it's interesting when you look closer at the altarpiece, you see those 4 rivers flow at the base of the cross and mix with the blood of Christ. So there's that beautiful metaphor of water and blood mixing together. And then right above, one of the short excerpts I asked for you to read is that moment of incarnation where you see Christ seated on the lap of God the Father, and then these rays of light through which a small homunculus or a little man with the dove of the Holy Spirit holding a cross fly across the scenes to the Virgin Mary. Here, a little tiny baby Christ is also holding onto the Virgin's neck, about to enter her mouth and then descend into her womb there. So these roundels, these circles, are the ones that I had you read excerpts from. That moment of incarnation, the events of the crucifixion, and then the gathering of all saints in heaven. And these fruits function as guides to prayer and to devotion. Portions of the text are written in gold leaf across the branches, which would have caught the light of candles in the devotional space. They're mostly abraded today or more difficult to read, but they really would have guided the practice of reading and thinking. When I went to visit the nuns at the church several years ago at the start of my dissertation work, I sat with Sister Margarita and with Marta, who began to recite passages of Bonaventure from memory. They have a replica in the church of the altarpiece today, since it was taken to the Accademia in the 19th century. And literally every portion I asked them about what is happening in the text, they could tell me not just visually what was happening, what I could see as an art historian, but what Bonaventure said. So in looking at these branches, they always reminded me to think about the senses. What are we smelling? And if I remember one moment where there were roses in a pot over in the corner of the room, and they asked me, what do you smell? And I had to stop to think for a moment. I thought, well, I'm smelling the soot from outside. I'm smelling my cologne. I'm smelling, finally we got around to, you're smelling the roses in the corner of the room. And remember, on the 5th fruit, Bonaventure describes the roses. And then in the middle of our discussion, it was a time for meal. So they brought out a soup. And when we started eating, the only conversation that was had was, what do you taste? And it was that slowing down and thinking about our senses that really captured my attention. And that's not something that we often experience in a museum context. I did write a proposal with one of the curators of the Accademia to have an exhibition that would think about this work in the context of spiritual senses in the medieval period, so that our labels would, instead of telling us about Bonaventure and Pacino di Bonaguida, who might have been the artist, would focus on, what do you smell? What are you tasting, as a sort of guide into these images? I think it's a really different way of thinking about text and images. And then one of my favorite details, as I was saying earlier, is the way that final fruit becomes a kind of flowering garden that you see here as the doorway leading into paradise, with all of these saints and angels sort of looking down and out. And in that final roundel just below, you see St. Clare, her head is there right above all of the saints as Christ ascends into heaven in that final fruit. So she becomes a guide for the nuns who are in the church looking at this altarpiece, meditating on the text, reciting the prayers and the words of Bonaventure as a guide to spiritual enlightenment. And then Francis, his head is slightly cut off. I'm sorry, Francis. Just above, he's seated there. aside God the Father. And then at the top of the crucifix, what the artist has added is a pelican piercing its breast to feed its young, a symbol of Christ's sacrifice on the cross. And in the Scrovegni chapel, Giotto also painted one of these animal symbols of the lion breathing life into its cubs as another symbol for God, God's love for humanity. This work, as I said, was reproduced a number of times. The artist or workshop that was thought to produce that very large altarpiece also produced an illuminated Bible, which featured the tree of life right at the transition between the Old Testament and the New Testament. And instead of showing scenes from the life of Christ, instead included prophets from the Old Testament in the roundels to represent the fruit. And then rising up to the top, we have the four evangelists that are the final fruits and the final branches. So the image was capacious to be used in many different contexts. And then one of the other images that I love of this same iconography is here in the refectory at the Church of Santa Croce, the church of the Franciscan order in Florence, the major church of the Franciscans. The refectory is their dining room. So imagine you're having your meals every day throughout the year. The scene that you see before you is the Last Supper down below, and then scenes from the life of St. Francis and Christ on either side, and then that wonderful monumental image of the tree of life. Instead of having scenes from the life of Christ, there are excerpts from Bonaventure's text. And so that context is a very different one, from the nuns who are thinking about the altarpiece in their private spaces to these friars who are seated in their dining room, eating and thinking about this text. And you can then imagine, I think, the sensorial experience of taste, smell, sound as well. There are moments in other Bonaventurean texts where he calls out the sounds of the bells that we hear, and imagine the start of prayer hours or meal times that would be called with the ringing of the bell that we heard earlier in our time together today. So I think in the final moments, I'd just like to ask us to be mindful of our own surroundings. If you have an opportunity to look out the window, I see a flowering tree right outside my window. The sun is finally out. I'm still smelling the myrrh. I still have the taste of coffee in my mouth from earlier. So I'm kind of alive and ready to think about these texts more directly. Because I'm not a literary specialist, I didn't know whether to walk you through the text. I think I'd rather hear some of your reflections on Bonaventure's writings, if you'll allow me. The words are really beautiful in Latin. They also sound beautiful in Italian, but they're not the kind of beautiful poetic rhythm that we will get with Professor Contino later in Dante. So I think that was the last image I wanted to share. I'm happy to keep the images up if you'd like for conversation. And then maybe after a minute, I'll stop sharing so that we can see our faces again. No, this was the last one. I forget. Just one last thing. If you wanted to take Bonaventure's text further and to read some of his texts in greater context, one of the other tree images that is used in some of the Bonaventurean writings and in other theological writings of the time is that of the genealogy of Christ, the so-called tree of Jesse, which we have in this other altarpiece at left. So the metaphor of a tree or genealogy coming out of the side of Jesse down below, slightly rubbed, and then rising up through the ancestors of Christ who's seated at the top of the tree. And the way this artist has used kind of visual language of trees or diagrams, so rising up to Christ at the top of the altarpiece, and then the moment of his transfiguration on the mount, to his ascension into heaven on the opposite side, the moment when Moses is in the presence of the burning bush in the lowermost scene, and the scene when Mary and Joseph and Jesus flee to Egypt and the trees bow down before Christ to provide food and sustenance for the Holy Family. So as I was saying, there are a number of ways in which this story of the Tree of Life is given new meaning in a number of other visual modes throughout the medieval and Renaissance period. So with that, I officially will stop chatting and maybe stop for now to answer the questions that I've seen come in.
Thank you, Brian. What a rich presentation, and what a great reminder of the way that for Bonaventure, the cross returns us to Eden, so that you go from the Garden of Eden through the fall, and the cross is almost transparent into the Utopia of paradise, which is a return to the garden, which is, of course, eminently Franciscan, God speaking through nature. Yeah. Any, I'm sure we have lots of questions, reflections, thoughts. Anna, please go ahead.
Hi, one of my questions was about I think it was one of the first images of the Tree of Life you had, where you said the background was, although it appeared black, now it was originally supposed to be a brighter blue. And I was just wondering, like from a art restoration perspective, like what is the thinking behind leaving it dark versus trying to restore it to what it would have looked like originally?
That is an excellent question. I'm going to bring up a website, I hope, in a moment. In the case of this altarpiece, we would be able to, or conservators would be able to clean the background to remove some of the grit and the grime, which would allow us to see the background more brilliantly. But there's always a risk because a number of these altarpieces over time have been glazed or varnished. And when you're removing those varnishes or those protective layers, you can risk in some instances going a little bit too far and removing some of the uppermost glazes that the artist applied. If I can share just for a second here. At the Getty several years ago, we had an exhibition called Florence at the Dawn of the Renaissance that focused on the time of Giotto and his collaborators. And this is an altarpiece in the Getty collection. I hope you're seeing it here. It's a triptych with scenes from the life of Christ on one side, this mystical communion in the center, and then another vision that a holy man called Chiarito had in the 14th century. This background we also know was bright blue. And so rather than the cleaning had already been undertaken and the conservators at the time didn't want to continue to, move down into the back, primarily because not only did the blue darken, but the pink robes of the figures have lightened. So they've faded because they have organic compounds in them. And then the greens down below have fallen off the altarpiece entirely. So there is a question about whether to in-paint or infill, and to what state do you take the altarpiece. So instead, we worked with a computer scientist and a color theorist who was able to digitally reconstruct the altarpiece. So this little detail that I might be able to, there we go, zoom in a little bit on the screen. He was able to virtually sort of reconstruct, sorry, I didn't do such a great job of zooming in, with colors that we know from manuscripts, for example, that haven't faded as much. The manuscripts, because they're closed for most of their lives, the colors are more vivid and they don't fade or fall off as quickly or darken. So we were able to use manuscript colors to replace this altarpiece colors when we knew they were the same pigment. So great question.
That's really
Stefano.
cool.
Thanks very much, Brian. This was super interesting. I was particularly into you started by looking at different traditions, the Islamic and Jewish tradition as well. And one of the things that struck me about your presentation is this kind of wonderful ambiguity of natural symbols, in the sense that the tree is the tree of sin, and it's a symbol of death, but then with the cross it becomes the symbol of salvation, and at the same time the water. I think you spoke a little about water. That's also has this ambiguous nature. It's the symbol of death, but then it's also baptism, it's also life. It's a life-giving force, which I find it attractive because it seems, also from a personal experience, it seems to suggest that same type of experience or symbol, if regarded through a certain lens, what seems to kill you is in fact a source of salvation, right? And I was wondering if there's anything similar in different tradition, Islamic or Jewish tradition, if you find something, or because I couldn't help thinking about, for instance, Greek or Roman ways of looking at art and nature, if there's anything similar to this.
I think it's a wonderful question. I was also reminded just briefly, I'll share my screen again because I wanted to show this image. When you mentioned water, Cindy, that I had only noticed in the detail from the Scrovegni Chapel, we see Jonah, going into the mouth of the great fish here on the side of this scene of lamentation. And then on the opposite side, there's the lion that I was referring to. So you have this water and air, interesting connection. I think immediately when you were asking, I started thinking about in Indian traditions, in Hinduism specifically, washing in the Ganges as a sort of symbol of purification, that sort of washing ritual. But then also in Islam, the ablutions that one would undertake before entering into prayer, washing as an important symbol. But whether they're sort of similarly related to death and then the life-giving property, whether they have that similar connection, I'm not as familiar, I have to admit. So I'm open to anyone else's thoughts. But I do suspect there must be that sort of similar push and pull between those natural forces that are life-giving but also life-taking. It's a great question. Thank you. I see. I think Daniel's hand
Daniel,
is up.
yes,
Right,
go
yeah,
ahead.
thank you. Sorry.
Just the provoking of how we interact with our surroundings and how plays such a huge role in that. Interested in that Professor Colburn sort of presented to us on the crucifix, because I noticed that the gushing of the blood on Christ is that was actually gushing. And I think for me, sort of connecting the two presentations, that was a much more visceral response in terms of like what my vision was perceiving. So I thought that was interesting. I was also kind of interested on why that might be between the two art pieces. Maybe Professor Colburn could a little better, but that was my initial reaction to that.
Cindy, do you want to chime in? I heard some of it. It felt spotty on my end, but
Yeah, it was a little spotty on my end too. So you went in and out a little bit, Daniel, but I'll try to respond. I think that in all the paintings, and we didn't get to focus so much on it just in terms of time, but like the wound of Christ with the blood, and like you said, Bryan talked about the chalice, right? And a lot of these are altar pieces, and so they're associated with the altar as well. But you do have this notion, even in the image of the Roger van der Weyden piece, where the blood kind of comes down from the wound, and then that red is picked up throughout the rest of the piece. Like this, this prevalence of both death, blood, and the need for blood for there to be then maybe perhaps even the white of the salvation and resurrection ultimately. And so you're constantly seeing colors are very, very meaningful in all societies, going back to the beginning of humanity. And so we see that continue obviously in the Christian church. So I think a real connection to the blood of Christ, the passion, the Eucharist, and Father Luke might also be able to contribute a little bit something here too. But did I answer your question? Because I only heard parts of it. Thank you.
Yeah, sorry about that.
No, it's okay.
But yeah, you did. Thank you.
No, really great observation.
And there is the passage in Bonaventure, it's in the part of the seventh fruit, where he does talk about the body torn by the blows of the scourges, pierced by the points of the thorns, now struck by the reed, beaten by the hands and fists, pierced by the nails, fixed to the wood of the cross. And then it goes on, and eventually you do get to the blood that flows down. So that idea, I think, even of the gushing is to draw your attention to that, the total suffering of Christ, every act that led to his ultimate death. But yeah, we're open to other thoughts as well. Thank you.
For those following along, that's on page 152 and 153 of the Tree of Life reading. Let's go to Andy and then Victor.
Yeah, thank you. I just wanted to say one of my reflections while looking at these art pieces. One was from the Crucifixion of, I think it was Giotto, and the other one was the Last Supper in Santa Croce in the refectory. And one connection that I see in both of them is this reminder that we're not innocent, and also that we're not in Utopia. It's kind of like an accusation against us, at least the crucifix is, because like Professor Colburn said, like, how did we do this? Like in other images of the crucifixion, it's more, spirit-like. God doesn't seem like he's in pain. Jesus doesn't seem like he's in pain. But in the crucifixion that we saw, that's more Renaissance, it's more humanist. There's more of a human aspect to Jesus. There's more, you can see his pain, both physically and just like emotionally. Oh, and also in Santa Croce, the Last Supper. We didn't really talk about this much, but the way that we're seated on the side of Judas, opposed to like the apostles. And the apostles are, we're not part of them. We're this like sinful other, and we're with Judas. So just like a reminder that we're sinful. We're not pure.
I think that was amazing. I think you're both a theologian and an art historian. You've said it brilliantly. Yeah.
And I think it's a great reminder of human fallibility. that, we can take with us in any context in terms of faith as well. Like that, it's okay to recognize human fallibility and to maybe have different views than others might have in certain areas, and to still continue to be a person of faith. And I think that's really important it's been very important for me for my faith journey. And I know I'm always quoting Paul Contino on this, but I had the wonderful opportunity to be on a trip with him at one point, and for a Pepperdine related seminar. And he said, if you're not, one of the things he said was, if you're not doubting, you're probably not really very faithful. And I think, sometimes when you're doubting the human aspects of something, as opposed, and for me, recognizing that human fallibility, I think, is important as you live, in attempting to live a life of faith, really. So.
And I think shared culpability is an interesting point to touch on what Andy mentioned, because even in the Santa Croce piece, not only are we on the side of Judas, but St. Francis, St. Louis of Toulouse, St. Bonaventure are there also at the foot of the cross in the Tree of Life image, embracing, hugging, weeping in prayer. So they are also, to the previous question we had about these models for viewing, they are our guides as well on the earth as we are, sort of living, even sanctified beings. Yeah.
And of course, for thinking of Father Luke's comments about the emphasis on Good Friday that many Christians still experience today, obviously, the moment in the liturgy where the congregation stands and shouts, "Crucify him," as part of the experience of the cross, that it's that, like Andy was saying, an experience of complicity is central to the Good Friday encounter with the cross. Victor has the floor for our last question, and then we'll go on to our break.
Thank you. When we see these notable changes from one trend to the other, were these artists conscious that they were advancing or pushing forward a new philosophical trend, or were just following an aesthetic trend that they were learning from their teachers? And also, what was usually influenced first? Was it architecture or the pictorial arts?
That is a great question. I think it depends on who you ask. I think Vasari would say, we have to have architecture first before we can have the other art forms. Architecture is the most mathematical, the most, divine. God is the divine architect. So that's sort of up there. It's a good philosophical question whether the artists are really conscious of that they're pushing the boundaries forward. I think from the passage that Dr. Colburn read from Dante, certainly the contemporaries recognized that Giotto was doing something different from Cimabue. In the same way that writers and other artists were working differently than their predecessors. And that is one of those sort of tenets of the Renaissance, is that conscious recognition that they're doing something different from the medieval world, that turn towards humanism, I think, that we've talked about already. But whether Giotto himself was walking down the street thinking he's doing something so novel, I mean, he's sought after also by so many patrons. So the people around him knew he's sought after by the Pope, by the King of France, by rulers outside of Florence. So his fame certainly was all over the peninsula and in parts of Europe. I don't know, Cindy, maybe you should have the final word to add to that.
I don't know about the final word, but I would say it depends on the artist. I think that certainly there were many artists who were either creating these works out of, as acts of devotion. Others were creating them because they were going to get paid. And but I do think that most of them put a lot of thought into their works. That last image I showed you by Simon Taparovsky, there's a great interview with him that was published, and I can send you the information on that if you're interested, by Damon Willock, who teaches at Loyola Marymount University. But he talks about his experience in creating that work as someone who was raised his background is Jewish, and so the research and the work he did to really try to truly understand Christianity, and to understand who this for him, this man was, who's millions of people are followers of. And so I don't think that there are too many artists who take on commissions like this without really thinking through it. But the extent, I'm sure it varies from person to person. Michelangelo is another great example where you see his spirituality changes dramatically over the course of his lifetime, and that comes through in his works as well. So it's a great question, Victor. And I think that I'd like to give them all credit and say they're definitely aware of transforming things philosophically and to some extent, but it's hard to know.
My thanks to Cindy and Bryan for those extremely rich images, and we all wish we could linger for many, many more minutes with them than the time we have, but we'll figure out a technical solution to share those with you and to sort of have them up on our website for your future contemplation over that very long holiday that we're all yearning toward. Before we take our short break, which we all need for our own bodies, let me just end with this wonderful reading, and I thank Bryan's initiative for sharing this Tree of Life reading from Bonaventure, which I had read years ago, but forgot how marvelous it was. At Jesus passing away, this is page 154, heaven and earth mourn and hard rocks crack as if out of natural compassion. O human heart, you are harder than any hardness of rocks. If at the recollection of such great expiation, you are not struck with terror, nor moved with compassion, nor shattered with compunction, nor softened with love. Let's take our short 10-minute break. We'll come back at 11:15 so that we can hear from Professor Contino and continue our journey in the middle of our seminar down into the underworld, like on the first page.
We're going to go to heaven too.
And then we're going to end up in heaven too. Not to worry, not to worry.
All right, we got 10 minutes. Is that right, David? So I can
That's right.
do a few things before we meet again. Good.
Correct.
Thank you.
Good to see you
right.
all.
Good
Okay.
to see everybody.